In January of 1968, the flag of the enemy flew over a town that Australia had sworn to protect. The National Liberation Front banner hung from the hospital, the church, the cinema, and the CIA office of Ba Ria, while the Australian soldiers assigned to defend it were 55 kilometers away, deliberately walking into a trap they had built for themselves. At that exact same moment, the most critical air installation in Southeast Asia, home to more than 500 aircraft and the entire American air war in the South, was under rocket attack, and the only thing standing between its destruction and the enemy supply lines feeding that attack was a handful of Australians from a country most people in that war barely noticed. Ask yourself this: have you ever heard of Operation Coburg? Most people have not. Most people who consider themselves serious students of the Vietnam War have not. And that absence, that specific gap in collective memory, is not an accident. It is the product of a system that was too busy managing its own embarrassments to properly record what ordinary soldiers accomplished in extraordinary circumstances. What the men of the 1st Australian Task Force did during the worst month of the Vietnam War was later described by military historians as some of the most brilliant combat action in Australian history, and almost none of it was ever reported, commemorated, or properly rewarded. Stay with this story to the end, because what you are about to discover will explain both how a critical piece of the war was won and exactly how a country can fail the soldiers who won it. To understand what happened in January of 1968, you must first understand the extraordinary confidence, bordering on delusion, that had taken hold of the American military establishment in the months before it. By the autumn of 1967, General William Westmoreland, commander of United States forces in Vietnam, was telling Congress that the war had reached a crossover point. Enemy losses were exceeding the communists' ability to replace them. The body count strategy was working. The light at the end of the tunnel, he declared, was visible. The progress was real and measurable. His pronouncements were broadcast on the same television screens that Americans watched every evening over dinner, and they carried the weight of a man who commanded 500,000 soldiers, the most sophisticated military technology in history, and the full industrial output of the wealthiest nation on earth. The confidence was not merely optimistic. It had hardened into institutional certainty, the type that stops asking questions because it has already decided on the answers. The generals in Washington and Saigon had built a worldview around their own success, and that worldview was about to collide with reality at catastrophic speed. What the American High Command was not saying publicly, and in many cases was not allowing itself to believe privately, was that its intelligence picture had been telling a completely different story for months. Enemy units across South Vietnam were repositioning in ways that made no sense for a force that was losing. Supply caches were being built up in locations that suggested preparation for offensive action on a massive scale. Communications intercepts were increasing in volume and changing in character. The chatter of an organization moving towards something rather than away from it. And there was the matter of Khe Sanh, the remote marine base near the demilitarized zone in the far north of the country, which the North Vietnamese had begun besieging with enough force to consume American attention and pull resources steadily northward and away from the population centers in the south. In hindsight, historians would recognize Khe Sanh for what it was, a feint, a spectacular and carefully engineered diversion designed to fix American eyes on the border, while something far larger and far more dangerous was being assembled in the cities and towns that the American command had convinced itself were safe. The architect of what was coming was General Nguyen Chi Thanh, the most aggressive strategic mind in the North Vietnamese leadership, and his plan was breathtaking in its ambition and terrifying in its precision. Between 85,000 and 100,000 fighters would simultaneously assault the national capital, 5 of the country's 6 autonomous cities, 36 of its 44 provincial capitals, and 64 of its 242 district capitals. All of it at once, all of it coordinated. Not a military offensive in the conventional sense, but a political earthquake designed to shatter the South Vietnamese government's credibility, expose the Americans as unable to protect even their own headquarters, and provoke a general popular uprising among people the communists believed were only waiting for proof that liberation was achievable. The timing was chosen with cold and sophisticated precision. Tet, the Vietnamese Lunar New Year, was both the country's most sacred holiday and its traditional period of ceasefire. South Vietnamese soldiers would be home with their families. Police and government officials would be celebrating. The country's guard would be as low as it would ever be during a time of war. The enemy had announced a 7-day ceasefire as part of the festival. They had absolutely no intention of honoring it. There was at least one American commander who read the intelligence picture with the clarity it deserved and had the courage to act on what he read. Lieutenant General Frederick Wyand commanded the 3rd Corps Tactical Zone, the military region that surrounded Saigon and included the most strategically critical installations in the country, and what he saw in the patterns of enemy movement in late 1967 alarmed him deeply enough to act rather than file a report and wait. He began quietly repositioning his forces, pulling units back from the borders toward the population centers, reasoning that if a major offensive was coming, it would come for the cities and the bases, not for remote outposts in the jungle. Wyand's preparations were not enough to stop what was about to happen. Nothing could have stopped all of it, but they were enough to change its outcome in several critical locations, and one of the most consequential decisions he made during those anxious weeks was to pick up the telephone and ask the Australians for help. The request went to Major General Douglas Vincent, commander of Australian Forces Vietnam, and what Wyand wanted was the entire 1st Australian Task Force repositioned from its base in Phuoc Tuy Province to the area northeast of Saigon, astride the supply routes leading to the Long Binh and Bien Hoa complex. Long Binh Post was the United States Army's largest logistics base in the entire country, home to more than 20,000 American personnel, the headquarters of the 2nd Field Force Vietnam, and the central nervous system of American military supply across the southern half of the country. Bien Hoa Air Base held more than 500 aircraft of the United States Air Force and the Republic of Vietnam Air Force, making it the single most critical aviation installation in the country. Together, they formed the most important military infrastructure in South Vietnam, and intelligence indicated they were directly in the path of whatever was coming. If those bases were severely damaged or temporarily neutralized, the American ability to fight the war from the south would be crippled at exactly the moment it was being tested hardest. The Australians were being asked to stand in front of all of it. The force that received that request was, in January of 1968, at the absolute peak of its strength and capability. The 1st Australian Task Force had been based at Nui Dat in Phuoc Tuy Province since March of 1966, carving its headquarters from rubber plantation and scrub, building a self-contained world of 8,000 men in a province the size of a small English county. 3 infantry battalions now called it home. The 2nd Battalion and the 7th Battalion of the Royal Australian Regiment were both veterans of Vietnam service, experienced and tested in the particular demands of this war, soldiers who had learned through hard contact what the jungle required of them. The 3rd Battalion had arrived from Australia only in December of 1967, new to the country and still absorbing the difference between training for this war and actually fighting it. Added to them was a squadron of Centurion tanks that had arrived in the same period, a significant and relatively new addition to the task force's firepower, along with additional Iroquois helicopters and the full weight of supporting arms, including the 161st Field Battery of the Royal New Zealand Artillery, whose precision with a howitzer had already become legendary among the men who had called for fire support in desperate situations and received it with almost supernatural accuracy. In the space of 6 weeks, the task force had effectively doubled its combat power. What had been a robust counterinsurgency force had become something approaching a small combined arms army, and it was at that precise moment of maximum strength that it was asked to split itself in half and go somewhere it had never been. Its commander was Brigadier Ronald Lawrence Hughes, born in Adelaide on the 17th of September, 1920, the son of a light horseman who had served in the First World War. Hughes had graduated from the Royal Military College at Duntroon in 1939 and spent his professional life learning war the hard way, in circumstances that left no room for comfortable theories or convenient assumptions. He had served in the jungles of New Guinea and Borneo during the Second World War. He had commanded the 3rd Battalion during the grinding static phase of the Korean War, learning on frozen ridgelines what it meant to hold ground under conditions that made every decision consequential. He had served as military attaché during the Indonesia confrontation. He was a man who had studied warfare across 3 decades and 3 different kinds of conflict, and he possessed the particular quality that distinguished truly dangerous commanders from merely competent ones. He understood that the map was not the territory, and that the gap between what intelligence told you and what was actually happening in the field was where battles were won or lost. He had inherited a task force whose previous commander had made an assessment that would prove catastrophically wrong. By the second half of 1967, the Viet Cong had apparently melted away from Phuoc Tuy Province, abandoning bunker systems and avoiding contact with Australian patrols. Brigadier Stuart Graham, Hughes's predecessor, had speculated in his final assessment that the enemy might have left the province altogether. What Graham had not understood, and what would become devastatingly clear within weeks, was that the enemy had simply stopped wanting to be found. They had not gone anywhere. They had gone quiet, which was an entirely different thing. Hughes agreed to Wei An's request, but he extracted a condition that would prove both prudent and entirely insufficient. One of his 3 battalions, the 3rd Battalion, the newest arrivals, would remain at Nui Dat to secure the base. The other 2 would deploy north. The condition was prudent because it left a reaction force in the province capable of responding to trouble. It was insufficient because what was about to happen in Phuoc Tuy Province would require far more than 1 battalion to manage, and what was about to happen in Bien Hoa Province would test the 2 battalions Hughes was taking with him beyond anything their training had anticipated. Nobody knew that yet. On the 24th of January, 1968, Task Force Headquarters under Hughes inserted by air into a new area of operations named A.O. Columbus, situated between Bien Hoa and Long Con provinces east of Bien Hoa, approximately 55 kilometers from Nui Dat. The 2nd Battalion and the 7th Battalion followed, the majority inserting by helicopter while the artillery moved by road. They were operating in the same ground where the 1st Battalion had fought as part of the American 173rd Airborne Brigade in November of 1965, encountering heavy resistance in bunker systems protecting key Viet Cong supply lines. The Australians were returning to contested territory, and this time they intended to be not just a blocking force, but the obstacle the enemy had no choice but to attempt to destroy. The tactical concept behind Operation Coburg was as aggressive as it was audacious, and it reflected a philosophy of warfare that was fundamentally different from the American approach that dominated strategic thinking in the country at that time. The 1st Australian Task Force deliberately placed its 2 fire support bases astride the enemy's lines of communication in the vicinity of the village of Trang Bom, between Highway 1 to the south and the Song Dong Nai River to the north. Fire Support Base Andersen was established 1 kilometer north of Trang Bom, positioned for easy access to Route 1, and placed deliberately across the main supply corridor the enemy needed to move its forces toward Saigon. Fire Support Base Harrison was located 10 kilometers to the west, positioned so each base could provide artillery support to the other in the event either came under attack. Both sat directly on the routes the enemy needed to use if it intended to sustain an offensive against the Long Binh and Bien Hoa complex. The Australians were not waiting to be found, and they were not defending a perimeter, hoping the enemy would leave them alone. They were making themselves impossible to ignore, presenting themselves as the one obstacle that had to be removed before the enemy's plan could proceed. They were the bait in a trap of their own construction, and the trap would only work if the enemy came for them. There was one element of that plan that failed almost immediately, and the failure itself was revealing. A small number of patrols from the Special Air Service Regiment had been included in the operation to provide reconnaissance for the task force. The elite soldiers, whose record across the entire Vietnam commitment would eventually stand at 1,200 combat patrols with 1 killed in action, a standard of operational efficiency unmatched by any comparable unit in the Allied forces. In AO Columbus, they were neutralized within days of insertion. The first patrol was called off because hostile forces were present at the landing zone in numbers that made the insertion untenable. The second attempt lasted barely 15 minutes longer before contact forced extraction. Joined into a combined patrol for a third try on the 29th of January, they made contact again within half an hour and were withdrawn. The finest light infantry reconnaissance force operating in Southeast Asia could not function in this environment because the jungle was simply too full of the enemy to allow the kind of silent movement that SAS operations depended upon. Every direction held a concentration of forces moving toward their start lines, with a purpose that allowed no deviation and tolerated no delay. The density of what was coming was so overwhelming that even Australia's best could not move through it without being detected. That fact alone, had anyone fully processed its implications, should have told the intelligence picture everything it needed to know about the scale of what was about to happen. The patrol clashes that began on the 25th of January told the same story in blood and in the mounting precision of the numbers they produced. Within 24 hours of insertion, B Company of the 2nd Battalion was fighting a 2-hour battle against 25 Viet Cong entrenched in a fortified bunker system. On the same day, 9 platoon of C Company assaulted a camp believed to be of similar strength and then held it for 19 exhausting hours under repeated attacks from what turned out to be a company-strength force that kept returning regardless of the casualties it absorbed. On the 27th of January, heavier contacts across the area of operations produced 14 Australians wounded in a single day of fighting. The New Zealanders of Victor Company, Royal New Zealand Infantry Regiment, fought a series of skirmishes across their sector that left 12 enemy dead and produced many captured weapons, at the cost of 2 New Zealanders wounded. On the 29th of January, D Company of the 7th Battalion contacted a battalion that was concentrating in bunkers and fought a 2.5-hour battle that produced 9 Australian casualties, including 1 man killed and 7 enemy dead. The enemy unit had been moving toward its designated launch position for the assault on Bien Hoa Air Base. The Australians had driven their patrol directly into a staged pre-offensive concentration area, into the middle of an army that was positioning itself with meticulous care and was not prepared to tolerate interference. The jungle was not moving away from them. The jungle was staging for war. All of this fighting happened before Tet had officially begun. It happened while the South Vietnamese ceasefire was still technically in effect, while soldiers across the country were heading home on Tet leave, while the official intelligence picture maintained its prediction of an offensive sometime in early February. By the 29th of January, the men of the 1st Australian Task Force had already spent 7 days in escalating combat against an enemy that was everywhere, moving in one direction and growing more confident with every hour that passed. Then at 1800 hours on the 29th, the South Vietnamese government began its 36-hour ceasefire in celebration of the arrival of the Year of the Monkey. Across the country, for a few hours, the guns went quiet, families gathered, food was prepared. The ancient rhythms of the holiday asserted themselves against the modern fact of the war, and for a brief window of time, something approaching normalcy seemed possible. The silence broke on the 30th of January. Viet Cong units in the northern and central military regions launched their attacks a full day ahead of schedule, a catastrophic failure of coordination that nonetheless produced one useful consequence for the Allied side. It forced South Vietnamese President Nguyen Van Thieu to cancel the ceasefire entirely, eliminating any remaining ambiguity about what was happening and putting Allied forces on alert before the main blow fell. The offensive proper began in the early hours of the 31st of January, when between 85,000 and 100,000 fighters simultaneously attacked their targets across South Vietnam. In Saigon, Viet Cong sappers breached the wall of the American Embassy compound. In Hue, North Vietnamese forces seized most of the ancient imperial city. In Dalat, in Can Tho, in Ha Trang, in dozens of provincial capitals and district towns, the sounds of combat erupted in places that had been considered secure. The war's most catastrophic month had begun, and for the men of the 1st Australian Task Force, it began not in one place, but in 3 places simultaneously. In the American sector immediately west of the Australian area of operations, Bien Hoa Air Base came under heavy rocket attack in the opening hours of the offensive. More than 500 aircraft were based on that installation, and the fire caused extensive damage to buildings, parked aircraft, fuel storage, and the facilities that kept the entire air operation functioning. The American 199th Light Infantry Brigade found itself in savage and sustained combat against enemy forces that had spent weeks positioning themselves for exactly this moment. Every Australian soldier in AO Columbus could hear what was happening to the west, could hear the explosions, and see the distant glow of fires against the night sky. They had been placed there specifically to prevent that attack from being worse than it was, and by most measures, they had succeeded in partially disrupting the supply and communication lines that fed it. But the attack happened regardless of their presence, and the sound of it carried across the rubber trees like a verdict on the limits of what any force could accomplish when it was asked to cover too much ground with too few men. 1,500 meters southwest of Fire Support Base Andersen, the village of Trang Bom fell to the Viet Cong on the 31st of January. The Australians of D Company 2nd Battalion and a Squadron 3rd Cavalry fought their way back into it that afternoon, clearing the village building by building in close quarters combat that left bodies in the streets and smoke rising from positions where the enemy had been dug in. The VC returned overnight and forced the entire process to be repeated the following day. The fighting was exactly the type that no training had specifically prepared anyone for. Angles too compressed for standard formations, distances too short for air support without risking friendly casualties, enemy too deeply embedded in structures that civilians had built and might one day return to. It resolved itself not through doctrine, but through the accumulated courage of men who kept going into buildings when every instinct told them what might be waiting on the other side. And in Phuoc Tuy Province, 55 kilometers to the south, the 1 battalion Hughes had left behind was about to find out what the Viet Cong had actually been doing while everyone thought they had gone away. Before dawn on the 1st of February, 1968, the D445 Provincial Battalion of the Viet Cong entered Ba Ria, the capital of Phuoc Tuy Province. The D445 were not a collection of local irregulars with aged weapons and amateur tactics. They were a seasoned provincial unit that had been in continuous contact with the 1st Australian Task Force since August of 1966. A force that had studied Australian methods through 2 years of close and often violent interaction that knew Australian responses and Australian limitations better than almost any other enemy formation in the country. They had prepared for this moment carefully, and they moved through Ba Ria with a confidence that came from preparation rather than arrogance. In the darkness before first light, they moved through the streets of what had, until that morning, been a quiet southeastern town where Australian soldiers went to have their laundry done, buy ice, and purchase fresh produce and souvenirs from local shops. 2 companies attacked the American administration and logistics compound. 140 men hit a separate American complex, and the police station in coordinated assaults timed to prevent any one element from reinforcing another. Another platoon seized the hospital, the Catholic church, and the town theater, occupying the symbolic as well as the strategic. The Viet Cong also took the bungalows housing the American Provincial Aid Organization, a CIA office, and Van Keep Airfield east of the town. By dawn, the National Liberation Front flag was flying over Ba Ria, and the key installations of Phuoc Tuy's provincial capital had been either neutralized or isolated. The Australians at Nui Dat were looking south at a town they had pledged to protect, watching enemy fighters consolidate their hold on it, and the reaction force they had available was a single battalion already stretched thin by the demands of providing base security. The response from the task force's tactical headquarters was immediate and based on catastrophically wrong information. Headquarters had been told that 2 Viet Cong platoons were causing trouble in Ba Ria, 2 platoons, perhaps 60 fighters causing localized disruption. Based on that assessment, they dispatched a ready reaction force of 2 platoons from A Company, 3rd Battalion, under the command of Major Brian Howard. 65 men in armored personnel carriers rolled out of Nui Dat on a mission sized for 60 enemy fighters and drove toward a provincial capital occupied by a reinforced battalion of several hundred hardened fighters in prepared positions throughout a built-up area. They did not know what they were driving toward. They found out when they arrived. Savage combat broke out from the first moments of contact. The Viet Cong had prepared firing positions throughout the tightly packed buildings of Ba Ria firing from cover with rockets, small arms, and machine guns sighted to cover every approach route the armored vehicles would use. 40 enemy would be killed in the first 24 hours of the battle, testament to both the ferocity of the Australian response and the accuracy of the New Zealand artillery that supported them throughout the night. But the Australians were also taking casualties in the compressed and unforgiving geometry of urban combat that none of them had encountered in this war before. The streets were too narrow, the buildings too close, the enemy too well prepared for the engagement to be anything other than brutal from beginning to end. At one stage, 2 platoons successfully pulled 3 American advisors to safety from buildings where they had been trapped and isolated since the initial Viet Cong assault. A second rescue attempt ended in death. 2 Americans and an Australian, moving with 2 platoon to reach another isolated man, were killed when armored personnel carriers were struck by rocket-propelled grenades. 2 more carriers were hit in quick succession. 2 platoon found itself cut off from the rest of the force, fighting off attacks with hand grenades in a narrow street, while South Vietnamese forces attempted to break through from a different direction and failed. An airstrike by F-100 Super Sabres was called in to clear the enemy positions, blocking the relief effort. Only after the aircraft completed their runs and 3 platoon pushed through the resulting chaos were the isolated men finally reached. Throughout the entire battle, the 161st Battery of the Royal New Zealand Artillery maintained its fire. 500 shells delivered through a single night to prevent enemy reinforcement of the town. 500 rounds of high explosive in the darkness, a wall of steel maintained with precision between Ba Ria and the forces that might have made it worse. The fighting cut the road from Vung Tau to Nui Dat in the first week of February, a road that normally carried convoy after convoy of essential supplies became impassable under enemy pressure, and the entire base at Nui Dat found itself dependent entirely on air resupply for survival. Number 35. Squadron of the Royal Australian Air Force flew its Caribou transports in and out of Nui Dat for 3 consecutive days, lifting 482,907 pounds of freight into the base by air. Not tons, pounds. Every bullet counted individually. Every ration carried individually. Every medical supply flown in individually through airspace that was anything but safe for slow transport aircraft. The task force was split across 2 provinces, fighting simultaneously on 3 distinct fronts, supplied entirely by air, with no road connection between its 2 halves, and no prospect of one being restored quickly. This was what it looked like when an entire war erupted at once, when the carefully managed tempo of counterinsurgency operations was replaced overnight by the unmanageable chaos of a general offensive against everything at the same time. By the afternoon of the 2nd of February, the Viet Cong had withdrawn from Ba Ria, pulling back during the night under the pressure of sustained Australian attacks and the relentless artillery support from the New Zealanders. The town was Australian again. The road from Nui Dat was not. The final accounting of the Ba Ria battle produced 19 Australians wounded, 40 enemy killed, and at least 14 more enemy wounded, seriously enough to require removal from the battlefield. It had been the heaviest street fighting any Australian unit experienced during the entire Vietnam War, combat of an intensity and character that the task force had not encountered in 2 years of operations in Phuoc Tuy. It had also been fought, in its opening hours, by 65 men who had been told they were dealing with 2 platoons. While that grim accounting was being made in Phuoc Tuy province, something equally intense and almost entirely forgotten was unfolding 6 kilometers north of Bien Hoa Air Base, in a patch of forest on the side of an unremarkable hill. No journalists were present. No cameras were running. The world's media was concentrated entirely on the drama playing out in Saigon, on the embassy breach, on the fighting in the streets of the capital, on the images that would define this offensive in the public imagination for decades. The contrast between what was being recorded and what was being ignored was total, and it would shape how history remembered this month in ways that would take generations to partially correct. On the morning of the 5th of February, 1968, C Company of the 7th Battalion was moving through forest in column formation, conducting a patrol in their allocated area of operations north of Trang Bom. The lead scout of the forward section, Private Clive Swaysland, heard a sound from the left. Chopping, rhythmic and deliberate. The sound of activity, of preparation, of something being built or positioned. The section halted immediately. The section commander, Corporal Graham Griffiths, came forward to assess. With him came the platoon commander, Lieutenant Mark Moloney, 23 years old, a graduate of the Royal Military College at Duntroon, who had, by his own later account, joined the Army largely because he was just after a job at the time. He had found considerably more than a job. The company commander, Major Graham Chapman, made the decision to send 8 platoon forward to reconnoiter the source of the sound, with elements of the Forward Observer Party and company headquarters attached to provide additional capability. What they found when they descended the slope and crossed a dry creek bed was not a patrol or a small logistics cache. It was a fortified Viet Cong regimental headquarters complex, a position that had been constructed and occupied by 3 full companies of fighters supported by prepared bunkers with overhead cover, interlocking fields of fire, and weapons positioned to cover every approach. The heavy machine gun that dominated the position was a weapon one soldier would later describe with precise and terrible accuracy as sounding like a .50 caliber heavy machine gun, the kind of weapon that does not just suppress infantry, but destroys the landscape they are moving through. The trees began to fall, not branches, trees, full-sized trees, sheared at head height by sustained fire of such density that one man later reached for the only comparison adequate to describe what he was seeing and called it the same effect as a chainsaw running through the forest. 8 platoon went flat and went there fast. The men who did not go flat quickly enough were hit. Private Mick Ayers, positioned 50 meters behind the point of contact, was killed by a stray round in the chest. 4 more soldiers were wounded in the first few minutes of contact before anyone had fully processed the scale of what they were facing. 8 platoon was pinned to the earth on a hillside in front of a position they could not see, could not adequately withdraw from without exposing themselves to the fire that was already ranging across them, and could not engage with any meaningful effect. Chapman managed the situation with the care and methodical precision of a commander who understood that panic in those circumstances would finish what the machine guns had started. He committed his forces in a controlled sequence, called in every support asset available, and worked the problem over 3 days with the patience that the situation demanded, but that few men could have maintained while their platoon was bleeding. 7 airstrikes were called in against the bunker complex over those 3 days. Heavy artillery from the fire support bases worked the target coordinates until the ground shook with the impacts. Helicopter gunships made repeated runs against the positions, expending their ordnance and returning for more. None of it was sufficient to clear the complex. The bunkers had been built to absorb exactly this kind of punishment, and they absorbed it. The enemy absorbed the casualties and remained at their weapons. Each morning, the Australians would assault a position they had attacked the day before and find it reoccupied overnight. Fresh fighters in the same firing positions, ready to begin again. Chapman's leadership throughout those 3 days was later credited by Moloney personally as having saved many lives in an action that the terrain and the enemy's preparation had designed to be catastrophic from its first moments. On the 7th of February, with 14 men already wounded across the company and 8 platoons still unable to advance, Lieutenant Moloney made a decision that no training manual had specifically prepared him to make, and that no rational calculation of personal survival could support. The radio operator for 8 platoon had been hit and his radio destroyed, cutting the platoon off from direct communication with the company. The machine gunner had been struck by a round that passed through the weapon itself before hitting him, a detail that probably saved his life, but left the platoon without its primary suppressive fire capability. Moloney surveyed what remained of his reduced and pinned platoon, assessed the ground between his position and the bunkers that were holding up the entire company advance, and gathered from the hands of every man within reach every M72 rocket launcher they were carrying. Then he rose from cover. He moved toward the bunkers. He fired the first launcher. He kept moving. He picked up the next one and fired again. He moved to the next position and fired again. He destroyed bunker after bunker in a solo assault conducted entirely in the open against a position that had been suppressing a full platoon for hours, and the men who witnessed it from their positions in the dirt described it afterward in terms suggesting they still could not entirely believe what they had seen. Corporal Edward Cherwinski was 5 to 10 meters from Moloney when it happened. The fire directed at their position had already been intense enough that a bullet had shattered the magazine on Cherwinski's own rifle while he was holding it. A second round had gone through his hand. It was his 21st birthday. He said afterward, simply and without elaboration, he did something that no one else was prepared to do. I just don't know why he did it. When Moloney finally stopped moving, he was covered in blood. 27 separate fragments of rocket-propelled grenade shrapnel were embedded in his back, wounds he had sustained during the assault and continued to function through without stopping, without retreating, without giving any indication to the enemy or to his own men that he was anything other than entirely in control of what he was doing. His men rose behind him and moved forward. The bunker complex fell silent, position by position, as the Australians cleared what Moloney had broken open. 9 men from 8 platoon were evacuated by helicopter in the aftermath. Moloney was the last man to board the evacuation aircraft. He would not leave until every one of his wounded soldiers was clear. The battle was assessed afterward by military historians who examined the records and the accounts of those who survived it as probably one of the most brilliant actions ever fought by an Australian rifle company in the entire history of Australian arms. It was fought in the middle of the Tet Offensive, in a patch of forest that appears on no memorial and is marked by no monument, unreported by any journalist, unrecorded in any contemporary account, except the after-action reports that would spend decades gathering dust. Private Mick Ayres was killed in an action his country would not properly recognize for decades. His parents, in the weeks after his death, received telephone calls from anti-war protesters who told them their son had gotten what he deserved. They carried that memory for the rest of their lives. The men who fought in the bunker complex that day received inadequate recognition for what they accomplished. The war that killed Mick Ayres was lost 7 years after his death. history expected everyone to make peace with all of it, and none of them fully did. With C Company's battle concluded and the task force redeploying southward between the 9th and 12th of February, the full weight of Operation Coburg came to rest on Fire Support Base Andersen and the men defending it. The 7th Battalion had been relieved by the 3rd Battalion and was returning to Nui Dat. The 2nd Battalion and its New Zealand company had already gone back. What remained at Andersen was the 3rd Battalion under Lieutenant Colonel Jim Shelton, the armored personnel carriers of A Squadron's 1st Troop, a combat engineer troop from the 1st Field Squadron Royal Australian Engineers, the 161st New Zealand Artillery, and an American battery of 155mm self-propelled medium guns that had been positioned there to extend the range and weight of fire available to the operation. Andersen was considerably larger than a standard fire support base precisely because of those American heavy guns, which required space and protection that pushed the perimeter outward and made it correspondingly more difficult to defend adequately with the infantry available. The 3rd Battalion had been in Vietnam for less than 3 months. Operation Coburg was their first major operation in country, their first extended period in contact with a determined and well-prepared enemy, their first real test of whether the training they had brought from Australia was adequate for the demands of this particular war. Shelton's men had already paid their dues in blood. 3 soldiers of B Company had been killed at Long Dien on the 8th of February in a close-quarters engagement that gave the battalion its first fatalities in the country. But there is a fundamental difference between the tested confidence of soldiers who have been operating in a theater for 12 months and have learned through experience where the danger hides, and the provisional steadiness of men who are still in the process of that education. On the night of the 17th of February, 1968, the 3rd Battalion's education entered its most brutal chapter. Outside the wire, on the slope of a knoll feature at the map reference Yankee Tango 202128, a small engineer standing patrol from 3 Troop of the 1st Field Squadron. Royal Australian Engineers had been positioned before dark to provide early warning of enemy movement toward the base. 4 sappers, young men with specialized military engineering skills who had been trained for construction and demolition and the particular technical demands of combat support, were placed in the night between the garrison and whatever might be moving toward it through the rubber trees. They were the system's first line of awareness, the ears of the base in the darkness beyond the wire. When the mortar barrage began in the early hours of the 18th of February, they were directly and completely in its path. The first assault on Fire Support Base Andersen opened with a sustained rocket and mortar barrage that fell with devastating effect among the most vulnerable areas of the position. The New Zealand and American gun lines were targeted. The mortar platoon positions were targeted. The battalion echelon area, where support troops who were not primarily infantry worked and slept, took direct hits. Then the infantry assault began. 2 waves came, each of company strength, the first focusing on the southwestern corner of the perimeter, where the concentration of support elements had created a sector that was simultaneously the most important and the most difficult to defend. The perimeter wire was breached. Enemy fighters entered the outer defensive zone. What stopped the assault from becoming a full penetration and overwhelming the base was the combination of mortar counter-battery fire that disrupted the coordination of the attacking force, claymore mines that devastated the assault waves at close range, and the sustained and accurate machine gun fire from the armored personnel carriers whose crews held their ground in the darkness, and the noise with a steadiness that those who were there still speak of with something approaching awe. A second wave came from the north and was broken up by small arms fire from the forward pit positions. 7 Australians and 1 American were killed that night. 22 Australians and 3 Americans were wounded. At dawn, 4 enemy bodies were found caught in the wire where they had died trying to breach it, and blood trails leading into the rubber trees indicated that many more had been carried back by their comrades under cover of darkness. The events and sacrifices of 3 troop, the 4 sappers on the standing patrol outside the wire, who were killed before the main assault even reached its peak, are virtually absent from the major Australian histories of the Vietnam War. Paul Ham's substantial and widely read popular history of the conflict contains no references to Fire Support Base Andersen, no references to the engineers who served and died there, and no references to the 1st Field Squadron. Royal Australian Engineers being part of Operation Coburg at all. The McNeill and Ekins official history, the government-commissioned 8-volume record of Australia's involvement in Southeast Asian conflicts, gives Andersen a brief passing reference that records nothing about the decimation of the standing patrol or the men who were on it. Among the soldiers who were present that night, 3 troops' losses across the full period of the operation, 7 men killed in 1 month, including those who survived Andersen, only to be killed in a mine incident in the Longhai Mountains 4 weeks later, are remembered with the specific and undiminished precision of grief. In the national record, they remain nearly invisible, their sacrifice preserved only in the memories of those who shared it and the documents that almost nobody reads. 2 nights later, on the 19th of February, C Company arrived by air to reinforce the garrison. The second assault came just before midnight, this time directed against the southeastern sector of the perimeter, preceded by heavy machine gun fire designed to keep defenders' heads down while the assault wave closed. Rifle grenades hit the forward positions. Satchel charges detonated against the assault pioneer posts. The attack was stopped before the assault wave reached the wire. 4 enemy were killed. The base held, and the men in it drew what rest they could before the next night arrived. The third and final attempt came on the 28th of February, and the method the enemy chose to deliver it illuminates something essential about how they fought and why they were so difficult to defeat. A Viet Cong mortar team moved into position using a Lambretta motor scooter and a farm cart, not trucks, not military vehicles, not anything that radar or aerial observation would identify as preparation for an attack. A civilian motor scooter and a wooden farm cart, indistinguishable from the agricultural traffic that moved through this landscape every day, carrying mortar tubes through the rubber trees in the darkness and delivering them to a firing position at the edge of the plantation. The team then manhandled the tubes the final distance to their chosen firing point entirely by hand, setting up with complete silence less than a kilometer from the wire of an active artillery base. The mortar barrage that followed was broken up by counter-battery fire before the assault wave could close on the perimeter, and 3 Americans were wounded. The mortar team was not found. The creativity that conceived of inserting a weapon system by Lambretta and farm cart, the patience that executed it without being detected, and the discipline that maintained operational silence throughout is the same combination of qualities that made this enemy impossible to defeat through firepower alone. They were not simply fighters, they were thinkers who happened to be armed. On the 1st of March, 1968, Operation Coburg ended. The 3rd Battalion and W Company of the Royal New Zealand Infantry Regiment redeployed to Nui Dat by air. The guns fell silent over AO Columbus for the first time since the 24th of January. The accounting began. The numbers are unambiguous on the question of tactical performance. 17 Australians were killed during Operation Coburg. 61 were wounded. 2 New Zealanders were killed and 15 wounded. At least 145 enemy were confirmed dead, 110 wounded, and 5 captured, with actual totals certainly higher given the blood trails, removed casualties, and the systematic undercount that characterizes enemy losses in every engagement where the opposing force controls its own dead. For every Australian killed, roughly 9 enemy fighters died. That ratio does not capture the full complexity of what the operation achieved and what it could not achieve, but it establishes beyond argument the tactical competence of the force that executed it. The broader strategic picture demands a different and more uncomfortable reckoning. The 1st Australian Task Force had been deployed too late to prevent the Tet Offensive from launching. The attack on Bien Hoa Air Base happened in the American sector, regardless of Australian positioning. The Viet Cong flag flew over Ba Ria for a full morning before Australian forces could reach it. What the task force demonstrably achieved was the disruption of enemy lines of communication on the northeastern approach to Saigon, the significant degradation of the forces feeding those attacks, and the successful interdiction of those same forces during their withdrawal south after the offensive's initial phase collapsed. The trap had worked as designed. The bait had held under pressure that would have broken a lesser force. The enemy had come and paid a serious price for coming. But the war was not won, and everyone knew it. The Tet Offensive killed more than 45,000 communist fighters against Allied losses of approximately 6,000 men. It was, by every military calculation available, a catastrophic tactical defeat for the North Vietnamese and Viet Cong, a military disaster that destroyed the cohesion of the Viet Cong as a fighting force and left the North Vietnamese army carrying the primary burden of the war in the South. And it was also the moment the war in Vietnam was lost. Walter Cronkite, the most trusted voice in American broadcast journalism, told his audience the conflict was stalemated and could not be won through military means. The images of combat in Saigon streets, of enemy fighters inside the American embassy compound, of a summary execution captured in a single photograph on a Saigon street, traveled around the world and demolished the credibility of every confident prediction that had been made about the war's progress in the previous 2 years. On the 31st of March, 1968, President Lyndon Johnson addressed the American nation and announced he would not seek another term in office. The war had broken him. In Canberra, Prime Minister John Gorton declared that Australia would not increase its commitment beyond 8,000 personnel. The ceiling had been reached. Whatever came next would come without more Australians being added. For the Royal Australian Regiment and the 3rd Cavalry Regiment, there was a formal recognition of what had been accomplished. Bien Hoa was awarded as a battle honor, one of only 5 presented to Australian units during the entire Vietnam War, appearing on regimental flags that most Australians have never seen, acknowledging an operation that most Australians have never heard of. It was the institution's way of recording what it could not ignore, and of doing so in a form that only those already inside the institution would ever see. The Victoria Cross paperwork traveled through the chain of command in the weeks after Coburg ended. Lieutenant Colonel Eric Smith submitted his recommendation for Lieutenant Mark Moloney with the full weight of his authority as commanding officer. The submission detailed the action of the 7th of February with the precision that the events deserved. The rocket launchers gathered from his men's hands, the solo assault across open ground under sustained fire, the 27 wounds absorbed without stopping, the refusal to accept evacuation before every wounded soldier was clear. Major Alf Garland, the battalion's second-in-command, supported the recommendation without qualification. Moloney himself, writing his official after-action account of the engagement, diminished his own role and redirected attention toward the performance of the platoon as a whole. It was the modesty of a man who genuinely meant every word of it. It cost him everything that the system had owed him. The Victoria Cross recommendation did not succeed. 3 explanations have been offered by those who investigated the failure in the decades that followed, and all 3 are probably true simultaneously. The chaos of Tet had generated such a volume of reports, casualty notifications, operational demands, and administrative requirements that paperwork of all kinds was swallowed and delayed or lost entirely. The award system operated under a quota, a fixed number of decorations that each battalion could receive in a given period, and the 7th Battalion had already exhausted its allocation by the time Moloney's submission was being processed. And Moloney himself had written a report that gave the system a reason not to act by declining to describe fully and explicitly what he had actually done when he rose from cover with 6 rocket launchers and walked toward the bunkers. He received nothing. Not the Victoria Cross that had been recommended for him by his commanding officer. Not the military cross that his actions clearly warranted. Nothing at all, while men around him received decorations for actions that did not approach what he had done. Major Alf Garland put the question plainly when it was raised with him years later. How can you have a quota on courage? Moloney returned to Australia and built a quiet life as a civilian in Canberra. He did not campaign for recognition. He did not give interviews. When the Australian War Memorial contacted him in 1997 and asked about his wartime service, he spoke entirely about the performance of his soldiers and said nothing about himself. His classmates from Duntroon did not share his reticence on the subject. Colonel John Paget, who had served alongside Moloney as a fellow platoon commander during the operation, became the primary and persistent advocate for recognition, filing submissions through the appropriate channels, pursuing the appeals process when submissions were rejected, and refusing to accept the bureaucratic silence that the institution offered as a substitute for the justice it owed. It took 55 years. The citation was finally published in the Commonwealth Gazette on the 19th of July, 2023. Mark Moloney, 79 years old and living in the Canberra suburb of Rivet, was informed that he had been awarded the Medal for Gallantry, not the Victoria Cross, not the Military Cross. The Medal for Gallantry, a decoration that sits below both of them in the order of precedence, the institution's final and partial acknowledgement of what it had owed him since 1968. His response, when asked about receiving it, was, "I am very proud of the efforts of all my soldiers and their loyalty over the years." 55 years after the fact, he still mentioned everyone except himself. Paget said what needed saying. It's always the quiet, humble blokes that shine when it all gets rough. He was describing a truth about character that anyone who has been in a difficult situation recognizes instantly. He was also describing precisely the kind of man that institutional recognition processes are designed, whether intentionally or not, to fail. Operation Coburg did not end the story it had set in motion. 12 weeks after the last helicopter left AO Columbus, the precedent that Hughes had established, that the 1st Australian Task Force would operate outside Phuoc Tue province in support of American forces facing a direct and serious threat, sent the Australians into the field again in identical circumstances on the 13th of May, 1968, as part of Operation Toanthang 1, the massive Allied offensive to sever Viet Cong infiltration routes into Saigon. The 1st Battalion and the 12th Field Regiment established Fire Support Base Coral in Bien Hoa Province. That night and the following day, Coral came under assault from a North Vietnamese Army battalion. It was the beginning of the Battle of Coral Balmoral. 26 days of continuous fighting, 26 Australians killed, nearly 100 wounded, the bloodiest Australian engagement of the entire Vietnam War. It was made possible in a direct and traceable line by the doctrinal precedent that Coburg had established in January and February. The precedent was written in blood. It was used again in blood. The war continued for Australia until the withdrawal of the last battalion from Nui Dat on the 7th of November 1971, and the final advisors came home in December of 1972. South Vietnam fell on the 30th of April, 1975. Everything the task force had spent a decade protecting was gone within 7 years of the last Australian leaving. 60,000 Australians had served. 523 had died. Nearly 2,400 had been wounded. The men who came home found a country that met them with hostility, indifference, or a silence that was in some ways worse than either. There were no parades. There were phone calls to the parents of the dead. What Coburg demonstrated, and what the entire decade of Australian service confirmed across 1,200 Special Air Service combat patrols, and the consistent performance of the task force in every major engagement it fought, is that tactical excellence and disciplined fighting can produce results that no amount of firepower can reliably replicate. That doctrine traveled home with the veterans and found its way, in time, into the curriculum of the units that would fight in Mogadishu and Kandahar and the streets of Fallujah and 100 other places that do not yet have names in the history books. When Allied special operators move through hostile territory with the silence that separates professionals from everyone else, they draw from a well that Australian soldiers deepened in the rubber plantations and creek beds of southeastern Vietnam over a decade of patient, violent, and largely unrecognized work. The methods that seemed invisible in 1968 are standard doctrine now. The men who developed them are mostly gone. The flag that flew over Ba Ria on the morning of the 1st of February, 1968, was gone by afternoon. The men who took it down are mostly gone as well, or old and quiet in the suburbs of cities that never held parades for them. They did not change the outcome of the war. No single operation could have done that by 1968. What they did was demonstrate, in conditions that left no room for comfortable interpretation, that courage and tactical brilliance can coexist with institutional failure and national indifference, that a soldier can perform with extraordinary distinction and receive nothing for it, and still, decades later, remember the work with a quiet pride that no bureaucratic process can either grant or take away. The men of Operation Coburg did not make it into the history textbooks. They made it into the doctrine instead. One is remembered by historians. The other shapes every elite military unit on Earth. There is an argument to be made about which form of recognition lasts longer, and the men who earned both without being given either deserve to have that argument made on their behalf. Now you know. Tell me in the comments whether you had heard of Operation Coburg before today, because the men who fought it deserve at minimum that someone is still paying attention.